Hello everyone, this is Pastor Ryan Pronzinski of Christ Lutheran Church in Michigan Center, Michigan, and this is my Chair Chat Daily Devotion for Tuesday, September 1st, 2020. Peace be with you. These video devotions are intended to help you engage your life of faith during this time of pandemic, and in lieu of today's video and yesterday's video, to help you engage your life of faith during this time of civil and racial unrest as well in our country. And so with engagement in mind, I encourage you to leave constructive comments, questions, or prayer requests in the comments section below, and I promise that I will get to these in the following videos. I also encourage you to do this because when we engage together and we learn together, we learn more and we learn best. We engage more and we engage best. So find ways, even if you can't in this digital platform, to find ways to engage with people around you, whether at home, over the phone, or even just engage with yourself by journaling and reflecting, which is better than nothing. But find ways to engage meaningfully, please. The readings that get put forth in these videos each day come from what's called the Daily Revised Common Lectionary, which is a church calendar reading schedule, and it can be found online. The readings for today, which are in the description below, are as follows. We have Psalm 17, but I will not be reading that today. But for details, please see September 1st's video. I will be reading 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 27b through chapter 12, verse 15. It's a continuation from yesterday with the whole David, Bathsheba, Uriah sinful incident. And then we conclude with Revelation chapter 3, verses 7 through 13, which, with regard to the book itself, is a continuation from yesterday's reading, which was verses 1 through 6 in Revelation chapter 3. But I'm not going to necessarily tie yesterday's readings with today's, from Revelation anyway. Now, before I get to the readings themselves, as always, I'd like to invite anybody out there who's watching these videos to come and join us at Christ Lutheran Church for worship digitally. We have been using Facebook Live to stream our worship services at 9:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sunday mornings. The link to those videos is in the description below. Feel free to watch past videos if you haven't seen any of them before, and feel free to join us for live streams when those take place on most Sundays. For this Sunday coming up, the week of September 1st, we will not be doing Facebook Live because I will not have my helpers, but check this YouTube channel out for this upcoming Sunday. The service will be posted there. All right, all that being said, we move on to the first reading, which comes from 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 27b through chapter 12, verse 15, which reads as follows. When the mourning, that is, sorrow and crying and sadness over loss, when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her, that is Bathsheba, to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done, that is adultery and murder, right, displeased the Lord. And the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to David. He came to him, that is Nathan, and said to David, and here comes a story. There were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought the ewe lamb up, and it grew up with him, the poor man, and with his children. The lamb, used to eat of the poor man's meager fare, and drink from his cup, and lie in his bosom. And this ewe lamb was like a daughter to the poor man. Now, there came a traveler to the rich man, and the rich man was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. But the rich man took the poor man's little ewe lamb that was like a daughter to him, and prepared that lamb for the guest who had come to him. This is where Nathan's story ends. The in-person event with Nathan and David picks up here in verse 5. Upon hearing this story, then David's anger was greatly kindled against the rich man. He said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity." Nathan said to David, "You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord, to do what is evil in the Lord's sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun." David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan said to David, "Now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that is born to you shall die." Then Nathan went to his house. Here ends the reading. So again, this reading in Samuel today is a carryover from yesterday, and I kind of described the events which took place in yesterday's reading in brief in the video from yesterday, and we get a summary again today in the text. Quote, "You have struck down Uriah," you being King David, "you have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife," which is a really soft way of saying you've committed adultery because David slept with her while Uriah the Hittite was still alive and Bathsheba was still married to him. "And you have killed him," that is Uriah, "with the sword of the Ammonites," right? That's the synopsis of what took place in yesterday's reading. And what's really amazing, though, about this story, which takes place right after all of this sin and violence, is firstly this. Nathan has the courage to call David out, right? Even though David the king could just as easily have Nathan killed too. If he can do it for one of his soldiers, he can do it for one of his prophets. David is king. Who's going to disobey the king? That's generally not a great idea. However, like I mentioned yesterday, Nathan knows that if he remains silent and doesn't call David out on his wrongdoing, David might continue perpetuating the violence that he has committed. Silence is violence. So that's the first amazing thing. Nathan calls David out. The next amazing thing about this text is that clearly David doesn't seem bothered by his violence and his wrongdoing, his adultery and murder as he's doing it. That none of that ever takes place in the story that would have been read yesterday, that all the events that took place before this reading. Otherwise, if David would have been so bothered by it, just thinking about it, he wouldn't have done it. At the very least, he might have stopped at the adultery and been like, look, Uriah, I got your wife pregnant. How can I make things right? But that's not how the story goes. But as soon as Nathan tells David a story, right, instead of calling David out directly, as soon as Nathan tells David a story that captures the wrong impact, the impact that David's actions did, right, without naming David as actor, David is able to not only hear and receive this critique from Nathan, but also agree with it in very strong language, right? Quote, "Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, which, as Nathan says later, you are the man." So David's anger is greatly kindled against himself. He said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity." And I think that this reality of David being able to understand the wrong he did, and even say he, as perpetrator, like the one in the story, is deserving of death. So in order to not only say that he was wrong, but that he deserved death, the only reason this could happen is because this reality was relayed to David through story, right? Or in a very creative and just wise way by Nathan, right? That speaks to the power and the fact that Nathan had to relay, though, that this wrongdoing to David in this way through story, right? It speaks to the power of sin and shame in our human lives, because we human beings, we hate feeling wrong, right, or bad, and we often seek to defend ourselves in these moments of people maybe calling us out on something we've done, even though when we hear them say that, we take it as a reflection on who we are. We have a hard time differentiating guilt and shame, right? And so we hate feeling wrong and feeling bad. And so when people call us out, we often seek to defend ourselves by talking about our intent. Well, I didn't mean for it to go that way. I didn't want it to be like that. Oh, all that stuff, right? Instead of just talking about the impact of what we said or did or didn't say or didn't do, right? Impact becomes more important than intent. I mean, as David set out this whole chain of events, his intent was never for Uriah the Hittite to die, right? Which becomes like the pinnacle of all the violence that David commits. Really, his intent at the very beginning might have just been to have a pretty woman sit in his presence, right? And then he just kept taking advantage of his power over and over and over again. But the impact of it all is, adultery and murder, and a family destroyed. So we can easily hear, though, just to get back to this human reality that we like to focus on our intent over impact, we could easily hear David saying to Nathan, if Nathan had just straight out called David out and said, "David, you messed up," we could hear David, the king, saying something like, "Oh, Nathan, I never intended for it to go that way, for Uriah to be killed. He should have just slept with his wife when I gave him a chance. No one would have known the wiser that she got pregnant because I slept with her, and none of this would have happened." Right? We could hear that happening. But David is able to recognize the wrong, the sinful impact of his actions, because Nathan wisely masks David's actions in a story that helps him focus on the impact of his actions versus maybe what David was intending to do and how it reflects, or how he feels it reflects on him as person, right? Put all that garbage aside and just focus on the impact. So again, first, that's the second miraculous thing that takes place in this story. So first, it's just the great courage of Nathan to speak out, even though he very well could have been putting his own life at risk. And next, we have this miraculous ability of David to recognize his sinful impact, call it wrong, even to the point of death, through the power of story that helps curb shame and defensiveness. And so maybe as we get on some other of my thoughts, we need to learn how to share story in such a way that doesn't shame or blame, but helps people understand their impact as wrongdoings are happening. And I'm going to specifically relate this to racial injustice because that's what's going on right now. But those are two amazing things. And lastly, what's amazing about this text is that once this recognition of wrongdoing by David happens, right, once he realizes he's the man, once David is taken past being defensive or trying to prove himself right, or that his intentions were noble, or at least not as violent as things turned out, once he's able to get past all this through the story that Nathan shares, David confesses. I mean, he doesn't just say, or recognize that he was wrong. It's not just a recognition, but then he actively confesses it, right? And repents. He says, I have sinned against the Lord. I mean, what a turnaround. What a turnaround from being an adulterer and a murderer and trying to cover it all up and pretend like nothing happened, to then recognizing, oh crap, recognizing I've done something wrong. And then lastly, straight out admitting it. And in such a way that it's I need to do things differently. All right, so what does all of this mean for us, right? Because I've been going on for a while about this story, but it's powerful. Well, right now, we're living in a time of racial unrest. That should be very clear to anyone out there that it has any kind of exposure to the news right now. I mean, there's mostly peaceful protests going on all over the place, in the country, especially after George Floyd and now Jacob Blake. And yes, there are, looters and other things. That's a whole separate category. Just as an aside, none of that should be happening, right? But primarily lots of peaceful protests over structural racism, especially as it concerns police reform and police brutality, and the higher likelihood of black men especially being killed by the police relative to how many black men actually live in the country versus how many people actually get shot. Anyway, if you pay attention to the news, you see this going on, right? So we're living in this time of racial unrest and reckoning, right, in the United States of America, where many people of the black community and other people of communities of color, and even some white people who are starting to wake up to this reality, the structural reality of it, the big problem of it, right, are saying that, they are saying they being the people of color and the black people specifically in the United States of America, have been getting treated like the poor man and his baby lamb in the story today, right, for a long time. That is, where as the white community in the United States of America on a whole, historically, right, has held more power and resources for a very long time, and I'm speaking communally here, you may not feel that way individually, even though the white people on a whole have held this power and more resources for a long time, it still feels like to these people in the black community, and arguably so, that the people of the white community still seek to keep the black community and others from getting what they need, and in a sense are taking from them then, or at least continuing to limit them by not confronting this very real structural racism that exists in the country, right? The lasting legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and the war on drugs and mass incarceration and all of these things that have, greatly impacted people of color and black people especially more than white people, right? And so this is the kind of the taking that's happening, right, by the white community, and by not listening to these people, which they feel like they're not being heard or seen or valued. Just think of Doc Rivers' interview. If you haven't seen that, listen to him. LA Clippers coach Doc Rivers, who said, we, that is black people, we keep loving this country and we don't get loved back, right? That's a pretty wide sentiment amongst the black community. And so when we don't listen to these voices and lift these voices up, right, it strips black communities of their voices, and equal opportunities and the ability, right, to share equitably in positions of power and leadership and resource management, and I got to catch up to my notes here. I'm going to stop and pause right there for a second. Like, this is all part of that, why they feel like the poor man in the story. And as, white people don't hear this and keep perpetuating this problem, right, it offloads, they often try and offload responsibility of reconciling and recognizing these past wrongs that continue to pile up on generations of black Americans and people of color. It's like a both and. Like, not only does this kind of taking keep happening through all the things I've named, but there's also this constant pushback of offloading. Like, we're not responsible. That's the past. We're not responsible. And so, what ends up happening, right, is people of color are protesting, and not just police brutality. That's just one part of a much bigger piece of the puzzle. They're primarily, at the heart of it, all of it, protesting structural racism in the United States that continues to get pushed off and not confronted by, especially the white people in the United States. And the people of color, especially the black community, again, they feel like the poor man in Nathan's story. That they are, and they are trying to be heard by the people in control. And to get them to change their ways in order to right the wrongs that have been going on for such a long time, right? And so clearly, right, if that's how the black community and people of color feel, like they feel like the poor man and who has the one lamb in the story today, they're not going to be the ones that are able to change the heart and the understanding of the leaders on their own, right? There isn't a poor person that comes up to King David in the story today and says, "You're the man," and David listens. No. The people that are crying out and needing help, they along with their voice, right? Because it's their story, and it's the story that has the power, but they need somebody to help relay this story to other people in power. They need a Nathan. They need an ally. They need an advocate like Nathan, right? Someone who can speak the truth of the poor man to power in such a way that the people in power will repent and change their ways, right? And rectify the wrongs. And that's where you and I come in, right? I'm assuming the people out there that are watching these videos are, going to be reflective of who I am. You're probably white Christian, and so we need to be like Nathan. As the church, as we will hear on Sunday, we are called, right? This is who Jesus calls us to be, to hear out, to lift up, and help rectify and heal wrongdoings when we know they are being done. And the church is not innocent of white supremacy and racism in the United States of America. In fact, we have helped prop it up, and I say this in general, like the church as in like all Christians across the United States history. I've been reading up on this. It's terrifying. We've propped up white supremacy and racism for a very, very long time. And so, like, it's on us to rectify the wrongs. Like Nathan, when Nathan says, "You are the man," when it concerns white supremacy and racism, like, that's us. Like, we are the man. So we are called to hear out, lift up, and help rectify and heal the wrongdoings when we know they are being done. And if you're watching this video and you're listening to not only me, but the people of color, you know these wrongs are being done. You can't avoid them, or at least, well, you can try. And so we need to talk, or we need to walk with our sisters and brothers of color and combine our voice with theirs in order to create the necessary dialogue and changes that will begin to right the wrongs of both the past, right, and the present structural racism that still exists not only in our country and in politics and in policing, but also even in the church. And for my ELCA people out there, just read Lenny Duncan's Dear Church book, right? And you will hear from a current ELCA pastor, man of color, how he sees quite clearly racism having an effect. Remember, this is structural, not interpersonal, not people, between one person and another, but structurally, how the church is even affected, held in bondage by this sin of structural racism. And so we need to do something about it. All right. And so in this text itself, I usually try and end with promise. There's really no promise in this text today, but just warning, right? That if we don't seek to right the wrongs, and if we let more wrongs continue on, life will be lost, right? Because of all the wrongdoing that David did in the story today, Nathan's like, dude, your child's going to die. And, violence is going to keep following you. There are consequences. I'm not saying people are going to lose their children, but, we can hear in this story that violence perpetuates more violence, right? And structural racism is extremely violent. And being silent about it perpetuates that violence. So again, I'll say the phrase, silence is violence. However, we see the consequences today, right, of this structural racism, of how it will affect life and loss of life, right? And so we see that in our own day. Jacob Blake may never walk again, right? He's paralyzed because of structural racism. 2 people in Kenosha, Wisconsin are dead because of structural racism, right? It inspired a young 17-year-old boy to bring an assault rifle or just a rifle with him and feel like he needed to somehow be out there, whatever. It doesn't even matter. It put him in a position, right, where he ended up shooting and killing 2 people. And now, right, so Jacob Blake, which led to the protests, and also, side note, the rioting and looting, which also, fired up, the 17-year-old coming out, right? This is all due to structural racism, and now a 17-year-old young person, right? They might go to jail for the rest of their life, or at least a very long time. They're going to lose a lot of their life due to the power, the devastating, sinful power of structural racism, right? And I say all this, and I try and put everybody in this category together because, the hate and violence, anyway, nobody wins. That's what I wanted to get at. Nobody wins if we keep propping up structural racism or remain silent about it or pretend that it doesn't exist. It's ruining lives. We can see that happening right now, right? So this is why we need to be like Nathan. We need to find creative, constructive, compassionate, but honest and very honest and transparent ways to have dialogue about this, right? Because, again, silence is violence. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the next reading because there is some promise in the next reading. So Revelation chapter 3, verses 7 through 13. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these are the words of the Holy One, the true One, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one will open. I know your works. Look, I have set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word, and have not denied my name. I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but are lying, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Because you have kept my word of patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. I am coming soon. Hold fast to what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. If you conquer, I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God. You will never go out of it. I will write on you the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem that comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Here ends the reading. So I'm going to start with a quote. I'm going to take some of the words out of this reading again, and I want you to hear them in this way. And this is the order in which they come. I'm just leaving out some of the stuff in between. I know that you have but little power. I will make them come and bow down before your feet, because you have kept my word of patient endurance. One more time. I know that you have but little power. I will make them come and bow down before your feet, because you have kept my word of patient endurance. And I lift up these words from the reading because I imagine whoever watches this video, and thank you for making it to this point if you have, and thank you for making it through. I imagine whoever watches this video out there, you might very well be thinking to yourself, how can I do anything about structural racism? I have but little power. This may be true. You may, relative to many other people, have but little power. But by the grace of God lived out in and through you, as you patiently, persistently suffer with and for those in need, and help make their voice heard, God promises that those who are doing wrong will bow down before your feet, like King David before Nathan. And God willing, these wrongdoers will change their ways for the benefit of all, not just the people who have been wronged, but they themselves. When wrongdoing is being done, the wrongdoers are in bondage to that sin too. We all need to be freed from it. And like in the text, as these people are able to bow down, repent, change their ways, like in the text, all will come to recognize and live out God's love, right? As you patiently, persistently endure. Endure and lift up justice, right? In God's word. So I'll leave it there and say again, peace be with you, and I will talk to you tomorrow.